At 6:40 in the evening, standing in a dining room I had decorated myself, Sloane Merriweather handed me a full kitchen trash bag in front of 41 guests and told me, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that the staff uses the back door. I took the bag. I carried it out through the back door exactly as instructed. What Sloane did not know, standing there in the dress I had steamed for her that afternoon, was that I had spent the previous 4 days quietly preparing to leave a house I had run for 11 years, and that the trash bag simply moved my last day forward by a little over 2 weeks. By 7 the next morning, I had 41 missed calls. Before I walk you through that evening hour by hour and what those 41 calls were actually about, tell me, where are you watching this from tonight? And what time is it where you are? I like knowing how far these stories travel before they're finished. My name is Delia Sandoval. I am 57 years old, and for 11 years I was the household manager for the Merriweather family in Greenwich, Connecticut. A stone house set back from a private lane where I arrived most mornings before 6 and left. Most nights, well after 9. I did not begin as household manager. I began as the person hired to help Sloane through the first year after her daughter Everly was born, when Sloane's own mother had recently died, and she found herself, at 34, entirely without anyone to show her how to do the thing she was suddenly doing. I want to say that plainly at the start, because it explains why the trash bag hurt in a way that a simple firing would not have. I did not walk into that house as staff. I walked in as the woman who taught Sloane Merriweather how to swaddle her own child. I want to describe that first year because it is the foundation everything else in this story sits on. Sloane was 34, 3 weeks past a difficult delivery, and genuinely frightened in a way she has never once acknowledged out loud since. Her own mother had died 14 months earlier, and Gordon was traveling 4 days a week building the firm he still runs today. I was hired through an agency for what was supposed to be a 6-week postpartum placement. I stayed 11 years. In those first months, I showed her how to hold a newborn against her forearm so the crying stopped, how to read the difference between a hungry cry and an overtired one, how to sleep in 90-minute pieces without losing her mind. She cried in front of me more times in that first year than in the 10 that followed combined. She told me once, around Everly's 4th month, that she did not know what she would have done if I had not been there. I believed her. I still believe she meant it when she said it. Everly turned 1, and the 6-week placement quietly became a permanent role. When Everly started preschool, the role shifted again into managing the house itself. The calendar, the vendors, the 2 part-time staff, the endless logistics of a property that size. I never asked for a title change. Sloane began introducing me, somewhere around year 4, as the person who runs everything, which I took as a compliment and which was, in a practical sense, simply accurate. By year 8, I held the security codes, the vendor relationships, the insurance schedules, and the household payroll. By year 11, I was the only person alive who knew how the heating system's zone controls actually worked, because I had been the one standing beside the technician when it was installed. I want to take you through that final day hour by hour, because everything I had learned about that family over 11 years arrived in compressed form inside a single evening At 6:15 that morning, I let myself in through the side entrance the way I had for 11 years, started the coffee, and reviewed the day's schedule on the tablet mounted in the kitchen. The Merriweathers were hosting their annual autumn dinner that night, 41 guests confirmed, a caterer arriving at 3, a florist at 2, a jazz duo at 6:30. I had planned nearly all of it over 5 weeks, as I had planned every gathering in that house since Everly's first birthday party a decade earlier. I had also, on the previous Thursday, mailed a signed letter of resignation, giving 3 weeks' notice, effective the second week of November. A letter Sloan had received, read, and responded to with a single text message, saying only that they would discuss it after the dinner. She had not raised it since. I had continued working exactly as I always had, because the dinner was already in motion, and because 11 years had taught me that leaving a job properly matters more than leaving it dramatically. I want to explain why I resigned, since it is the quiet architecture underneath everything that happened that night. 6 months earlier, Sloane's husband Gordon had brought in a household consultant, a man named Hollis Kavanagh, who specialized in what his own website described as staffing efficiency for high net worth residences. Hollis spent 2 days observing the household, then produced a report recommending that my position be restructured, my salary reduced by roughly 18%, and my responsibilities split between a part-time cleaner and a virtual assistant service based in another state. Gordon presented this to me in his study as an opportunity to focus on the parts of the role I enjoyed most. I asked whether the reduction would affect the retirement contribution the family had matched for 9 years, a benefit that represented the single largest piece of my own financial planning. Gordon told me he would look into it. He never did. I asked again in July. I asked again in August. In September, I asked Sloan directly, and she told me that Gordon handled the financial side of the household and that she didn't want to be in the middle of it, a sentence I had heard from her in various forms. For 11 years, whenever a question required her to choose between her own comfort and my situation. In early October, I called the plan administrator myself and learned that the family's matching contributions had stopped in April, 6 months earlier, without anyone telling me, and that the account had been quietly reclassified in a way that reduced what I would eventually receive by roughly $26,000. I did not confront anyone. I wrote a resignation letter, gave 3 weeks' notice, and began in the evenings organizing 11 years of household records into a form my replacement could actually use. I want to be honest that assembling that binder was, in its own way, the hardest part of leaving. 3 weeks of evenings spent writing down everything I knew about a house I was no longer going to be in. Which plumber to call and which one to avoid. That the wine cellar's humidity sensor reads 2 points high and has since 2021. That the gardener's invoices arrive by mail and not by email, and that he does not check email at all. That Everly is allergic to almonds but not to almond extract, a distinction that had confused 2 caterers over the years. I wrote all of it down because I could not imagine doing otherwise, and because 11 years in someone's house builds a kind of custodianship that does not switch off just because the arrangement has ended. I have thought since about how strange it is that I spent those 3 weeks protecting a household that had spent 6 months quietly reducing what it owed me. There was one more thing I noticed during those weeks, which I did not understand until later. Hollis Kavanagh's efficiency report, which Gordon had left on the household office desk, and which I had read more carefully than anyone probably intended, contained a line describing the household's staffing costs as an area where meaningful savings could be realized without service degradation. Given the current staff members' demonstrated willingness to absorb expanded responsibilities without corresponding compensation adjustments. That sentence, written by a stranger who had spent 2 days in that house, described 11 years of my life more accurately and more coldly than anyone in the family ever had. At 8:10 that morning, Everly came downstairs. She is 20 now, home from her second year at university, and she sat at the kitchen island with her coffee the way she has sat there since she was tall enough to climb onto the stool. She asked me whether I was really leaving. I told her I was. She asked why, and I told her the truth in the shortest form I could manage, that the arrangement had changed, and that I had decided the change did not work for me. She was quiet for a moment, then said that her mother had told her I was retiring, which was not what I had written in my letter, and not what I had told anyone. I did not correct the record with her. I told her only that whatever her mother said, I wanted her to know from me directly that I had made the decision myself and that it had nothing to do with her. At 11 that morning, Sloane came into the kitchen with a list of adjustments for the evening. She wanted the seating chart redone to move a couple she had recently fallen out with away from the head of the table. She wanted the wine service changed. She wanted the outdoor heaters moved to the terrace despite a forecast of no wind. I made all 3 changes. She did not mention my letter. She did not mention the retirement story she had apparently told her own daughter. She thanked me twice, briefly, in the passing way she had thanked me for 11 years, and went upstairs. At 12:30, I ate a sandwich standing at the counter, which is how I had eaten lunch in that house for 11 years, and I remember thinking, with the specific clarity that comes near the end of something, that I had never once sat down to eat in that kitchen. Not because anyone forbade it, because the rhythm of the job had never left a gap wide enough, and because sitting down had somehow, over a decade, come to feel like something that belonged to other people in that house rather than to me. At 2, the florist arrived, a woman named Petra Lindgren I had worked with for 7 years, and she asked me while we trimmed stems together whether the rumor was true that I was leaving. I told her it was. She stopped what she was doing and said she was sorry to hear it, and then, after a pause, that she was not entirely surprised, since she had noticed over the last year that decisions in that house had started coming from Gordon rather than from Sloane, and that in her experience that shift usually preceded a household reorganizing itself around cost rather than around care. At 3, the caterer arrived with a crew of 6. At 4:15, I steamed Sloane's dress and laid out the jewelry she had asked for, the same as I had done for perhaps 200 evenings across 11 years. At 4:40, Gordon passed through the kitchen, saw me, and said, without stopping, that we should sit down soon about the transition. I said that would be fine. He did not specify when, and I understood by then that he did not intend to. At 5, I did a final walk of the dining room, straightening 41 place cards I had written by hand 3 nights earlier, because Sloan had decided that printed cards looked corporate. At 5:20, I checked the terrace heaters I had been asked to move and found, as I expected, that the terrace was empty and would remain so all evening. At 5:40, the jazz duo arrived early, and I set them up in the corner of the front room with a glass of water each. At 6, guests began arriving. At 6:40, it happened. The kitchen bin had filled faster than expected during service, and one of the caterer's staff had left a tied bag beside the door rather than carrying it out mid-course. Sloan came into the kitchen, saw the bag, and picked it up herself, which surprised me, since I had never once seen her carry anything to the bins. She walked back through the dining room holding it, past the head of the table where 6 guests were seated, found me by the sideboard where I was resetting water glasses, and held it out to me. She said clearly that the staff uses the back door, and that she would appreciate it if the staff remembered that going forward, since guests should not have to look at that. I want to describe the room in that moment as precisely as I can. The jazz duo kept playing. 2 women near the window stopped mid-conversation. A man I recognized as one of Gordon's business partners looked down at his plate with the particular focus people adopt when they have decided not to have seen something. Everly, seated near the far end, went completely still, and I felt, standing there with the bag in my hand, something that surprised me by how quiet it was. Not humiliation exactly, something closer to a rival. The sensation of a long argument inside my own head finally being settled by someone else, out loud, in front of witnesses. I took the bag. I said evenly, of course, and I carried it out through the back door. Then I kept walking. I got into my car, drove home to my apartment 15 minutes away, and did not return to that house again. I want to say something about the drive, because it is the part I remember most clearly. I did not cry. I did not rehearse arguments I should have made. I drove the post road with the radio off and thought about a specific night 11 years earlier when Everly, 4 months old and inconsolable, had finally fallen asleep against my shoulder at 2 a.m, and Sloan had stood in the doorway of that nursery watching us and whispered that she did not know how I did it. I thought about how, in that doorway, she had not been able to say the word staff about me if she had tried. Somewhere across 11 years, without either of us marking the day it happened, the word had become available to her. That was what I thought about on the post road. Not the bag, the distance between one doorway and one dining room. At 7:15 that evening, my phone began ringing. I want to be honest that I expected the calls to be about the dinner, about the coffee service that still needed setting up, about the dessert plating I had left instructions for on the counter, about the 41 guests still seated in a house whose entire operating knowledge existed inside my head and nowhere else. Some of them were. Sloan called 4 times between 7:15 and 8. Gordon called twice. The caterer, whose number I had given him personally that afternoon, called once with a question about which cabinet the serving platters lived in. What I did not expect were the other calls. At 7:40, My phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and I answered because 11 years of household management had trained me to answer unknown numbers. It was a woman named Corinne Ballard, who introduced herself as a guest at the dinner and told me she had watched what happened from 4 seats away. She said she had run her own household staff for 20 years, that she had recognized me because I had coordinated a joint event between our 2 families 3 years earlier, and that she wanted to know whether I had somewhere to go. Then she asked whether I would be interested in a position, since her own house manager was retiring in January, and she had been dreading the search. I did not say yes that night. I told her I was not in any condition to make a decision at 7:40 in the evening, and she said she understood completely and gave me her number to call in a week. I want to note something about that call, since it matters for what followed. Corinne told me, before she hung up, that at least 3 other people at that table had asked, quietly, over dessert, who I was and whether that was normal in that house. I want to describe what happened inside that house after I left, since I learned most of it later from Everly and from the caterer, who called me twice more over the following week for reasons that had nothing to do with platters. Dessert service did not happen on schedule because the plating instructions I had left on the counter assumed someone would be there to execute them, and nobody was. The coffee was served nearly 40 minutes late. At some point around 9, Sloan apparently went upstairs and did not come back down for the remainder of the evening, leaving Gordon to see the last guests out. Everly told me she found her mother sitting on the edge of the bed in her dress, and that when she asked what had happened, Sloan said only that I had walked out in the middle of a dinner party, which was true in the narrowest possible sense and false in every way that mattered. The caterer, a man named Desmond Okafor, who had worked perhaps 30 events in that house with me over 4 years, told me on the phone the next day that he had been the one who eventually located the dessert instructions, and that he had also been asked by Gordon at 10:15 that night whether he knew how to shut down the outdoor heaters. He said he had told Gordon he did not, and that Gordon had stood on the terrace for several minutes looking at a control panel in a house he had lived in for 14 years. By 7 the next morning, I had 41 missed calls. I counted them sitting at my own kitchen table with coffee I had made for myself for the first weekday morning in 11 years. Sloan, 11 times. Gordon, 6. Everly, 4. The caterer, twice. Corinne Ballard, once. A florist I had worked with for years, once, asking if I was all right, because word had apparently reached her by 10 that night. And 16 calls from numbers I did not recognize, which turned out, over the following days, to be a mix of 2 other Greenwich families whose managers had heard the story, a placement agency I had never registered with, and Hollis Kavanagh, the efficiency consultant, calling from a Manhattan number at 6:50 in the morning. I want to describe the Hollis Kavanagh call because it explains the practical consequence of what happened in a way the emotional ones do not. When I called him back, he was considerably less confident than his report had been. He explained, carefully, that Gordon had asked him to assist with an immediate replacement search, and that in the course of preparing a job description, he had discovered that no one in the household could produce the vendor contracts, the security system access protocols, the insurance schedules for the art and the wine, the maintenance contracts for the heating system, the property tax escrow information. or the household payroll records for the 2 part-time staff I managed. He asked whether I would be willing to consult on a transition at an hourly rate to reconstruct that information. I told him the truth, which was that all of it existed, organized and labeled, in a binder and a shared drive I had spent 3 weeks assembling specifically so that my departure in November would not leave anyone stranded. I told him the binder was in the second drawer of the household office desk, that the drive credentials were written on the first page, and that I had prepared it as part of a proper 3-week notice that had been cut short at 6:40 the previous evening by a decision that was not mine. Then I told him I would not be consulting. I want to be honest about why I refused, since I have thought about it many times. It was not spite, or at least not only spite. It was that Hollis Kavanaugh's report 6 months earlier had described my position as a set of tasks that could be split between a cleaner and a virtual assistant, and I had decided somewhere between 6:40 that evening and 6:50 the next morning that I was no longer willing to personally rescue people from the consequences of believing that. Gordon called me himself at 9 that morning. He apologized, at length and somewhat awkwardly, for what he described as an unfortunate moment. I told him I was less interested in the moment than in the 6 months of unanswered questions about the retirement match that preceded it. He went quiet, then admitted that he had known the matching contributions stopped in April, that it had been part of the restructuring Hollis recommended, and that he had not told me because he had been waiting for what he called the right time. I asked him whether he understood that $26,000 had been removed from my retirement without a single conversation. He said he did now. I asked him one more question on that call, which I had not planned to ask. I asked whether Sloan had known about the matching contributions stopping in April. He hesitated long enough that the answer was already delivered, then said that she had known in a general sense, that they had discussed the restructuring together before Hollis was ever brought in, and that she had agreed the household budget needed adjusting. So every time I had asked her about it over 6 months, and every time she had told me that Gordon handled the financial side, and she did not want to be in the middle, she had already been in the middle. She had simply preferred that I not know she was standing there, that more than the bag is the part I have had to make peace with. The bag was one bad evening, and bad evenings happen to everyone. The 6 months of being told, gently and repeatedly, that a decision she had helped make was not hers to discuss. That was not an evening. That was a method. The family's own attorney contacted me 8 days later, which told me more about how seriously they were taking it than anything Gordon said on the phone. I had by then spoken with an employment attorney of my own, a direct, unhurried woman named Tobias Renfrew's associate at a small firm in Stamford, who explained that the unilateral change to a matching benefit I had participated in for 9 years, made without notice, along with the constructive circumstances of my departure, created a real exposure for the family, regardless of how the final evening had unfolded. The matter settled without a filing. The Merriweathers restored the $26,400 in missed contributions, paid the remaining 3 weeks of my notice period, and added a severance equal to 8 weeks, a total settlement of $43,200, along with a neutral written reference confirming 11 years of service in the role of household manager. I want to be clear that I did not ask for an apology as part of that settlement, and I did not receive one in writing. I have come to think that was the right outcome. An apology extracted through an attorney is not an apology. It is a line item. Everly called me again in December, home for winter break. She told me she had asked her mother directly why she had told her I was retiring when I had actually resigned, and that her mother had said it was simpler. Everly said she had also asked about the dinner, and that Sloan had described it as a misunderstanding, that she had simply asked for help with the bag and I had overreacted by leaving. Everly told me she had been sitting 11 feet away and that it had not been a misunderstanding. I told her I appreciated her saying so, and that she did not need to litigate her own mother on my behalf. And she told me she wasn't doing it on my behalf. She was doing it because she wanted to be the kind of person who says what she actually saw. I started with Corinne Ballard in January. The house is smaller. The salary is roughly the same as what I earned before the restructuring. The retirement match is written into a signed agreement rather than assumed, and there is a clause, which Corinne added herself without my asking, specifying 30 days written notice from either party. On my first day, she walked me through the house and then handed me a printed sheet listing every vendor, every account, and every access code, and told me that she had learned, watching what happened at the Merriweather's table, that a household that lives entirely inside one person's head is a badly run household, and that she did not intend to run one. I have been there 10 months now. Corinne eats lunch at the kitchen island most days, and on my second week, she asked why I always ate standing up. I told her the truth, that 11 years had trained me out of sitting, and she said, without making a speech about it, that she would like me to sit, and that if it took a while to feel natural, that was fine. It took about a month. It is a small thing. It is also the clearest measure I have of the difference between the two houses. Word about that autumn dinner moved through Greenwich the way these things do, slowly and permanently. I know, because 2 different household managers have mentioned it to me since, that the Merriweathers went through 3 replacements in 14 months. I take no particular satisfaction in that. What I do notice is that nobody in that circle now describes what happened as a misunderstanding, because 41 people were sitting in that room, and a story told to 41 witnesses does not stay in the version its author prefers. I think about that evening often, and what I keep returning to is not the bag itself. It is that Sloan genuinely believed in that moment that she was correcting a member of staff, and that 11 years earlier she had sat on the floor of a nursery at 2 a.m. while I showed her how to hold her own daughter, and that both of those things were true about the same woman. People do not usually decide to erase someone all at once. They arrive at it gradually, one convenient reclassification at a time, until the word staff feels accurate enough to say out loud at a dinner party. The restructuring came first. The reclassified retirement account came second. The bag was simply the last item on a list that had been getting written for 6 months. I have also thought about the 41 calls and about the fact that the number matched the guest list exactly by coincidence, and not by design, which is the sort of thing that would feel invented if it had not actually happened. 39 of those calls were from people wanting something from me: information, a transition, an explanation, a rescue. 2 of them, Corinne's and the florist's, were from people asking whether I was all right. I have kept that ratio in mind ever since, not with bitterness, but as a genuinely useful measurement. 11 years inside a household, and when it ended at 6:40 on a Tuesday evening, the people who called to ask after me, rather than after the house, numbered 2. Everly makes 3, though her calls came later, and she was 20 and not obligated to make any of them. She still texts me. She sent a photograph in the spring of a swaddled newborn belonging to a friend of hers, with a message saying she had tried the fold I taught her when she was 15 and that it had worked on the first attempt. I have kept that message. It is, as far as I am concerned, the actual reference letter from those 11 years. The one the attorneys negotiated is in a drawer somewhere, and I have never once needed to look at it. So I will ask you the question I still turn over some nights. If someone handed you a trash bag in front of 41 people after 11 years inside their house, would you have taken it and stayed to finish the evening the way you always had? Or would you have carried it out the back door the way I did and simply kept walking? This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and reflection, with the assistance of artificial intelligence, and any resemblance to real people, names, or events is entirely coincidental. Nothing in this video constitutes legal or financial advice, and anyone with questions about retirement benefits, notice periods, or the terms of their own employment should consult a licensed employment attorney in their own state, since these rules vary considerably from one jurisdiction to the next. If this stayed with you, I would love to hear where you're watching from tonight, and I hope you'll come back for the next one.